To understand the sheer magnitude of what happened in Lower Silesia, you cannot simply start with the war. You have to begin with the silence. Before the first jackhammer struck the stone, the Owl Mountains were a place of ancient, undisturbed quiet. Geologically, this is one of the oldest spines of the European continent. The rock here is Archean gneiss, a metamorphic stone formed under immense pressure and heat billions of years ago. It is grey, brutal, and incredibly dense. To a climber, it is unforgiving. To a military engineer in 1943, however, this density was not an obstacle. It was a promise. It promised a shield that no bomb made by human hands could penetrate. By late 1943, the mood in the Third Reich had shifted from arrogance to a creeping existential dread. The Allied bombing campaigns over the Ruhr Valley and Hamburg had proven that the Luftwaffe could no longer guarantee the safety of German skies. The armaments minister, Albert Speer, faced a logistical nightmare. Factories were burning. Blueprints were turning to ash. The Nazi high command realized that the surface of the earth was no longer safe for the machinery of war. They needed a new domain. They looked east to the Sudetenland, a territory that had been annexed and was considered historically German. Here, far from the range of American escort fighters, lay the Owl Mountains. The decision to launch Project Riese was not a standard military construction order. It was a decree of industrial colonization. In November 1943, the newly formed Schlesische Industriegemeinschaft, the Silesian Industrial Company, was established with a singular, covert purpose: to prepare the ground for the largest construction project in the history of the Reich. The code name chosen was fitting: Riese, the giant. The ambition was terrifyingly simple: to hollow out the mountains and place the brain and the heart of the Nazi war machine inside the earth. The first phase of the operation was the Sperrgebiet, the creation of a forbidden zone. This was not merely about putting up fences, it was the systematic erasure of civilian life. The villages of Wüsterwaltersdorf, Dörnhau, and Oberwüstergiersdorf saw their populations evicted. Guest houses, schools, and textile factories were commandeered instantly. The local population, mostly German civilians, were told that this was a matter of supreme national importance. They were moved out to make way for the SS, the organization taught administrators, and the architects who arrived from Berlin in convoys of black Mercedes sedans. The transformation of the landscape was violent. The serene mountain roads used for centuries by logging carts were suddenly choked with heavy diesel trucks. The air, once smelling of pine resin, began to reek of exhaust fumes and raw concrete. The organization TOT, the paramilitary engineering group responsible for the Atlantic Wall, brought their heavy equipment. Giant excavators, rock crushers, and narrow-gauge railway locomotives were unloaded at the railway stations. The sleepy provincial train lines were upgraded overnight to handle heavy freight. But the most crucial resource required for Riese was not steel or concrete. It was electricity. Before a single tunnel could be bored, the mountains had to be wired. A massive infrastructure project was launched just to power the construction sites. High-voltage lines were strung through the valleys, cutting ugly scars through the ancient forests. Transformer stations were built in secret locations, disguised as farm buildings. The energy consumption of the construction site alone rivaled that of a major city like Breslau. This power was needed for the compressors, the giant machines that would pump air into the pneumatic drills at the tunnel faces. The plan called for 7 distinct underground complexes: Osówka, Włodarz, Rzeczka, Żugowice, Sobon, Gontowa, and the prestigious Książ Castle. These were not to be isolated bunkers. The ultimate vision was a subterranean megalopolis. Engineers drafted plans for tunnels that would connect these sites underground, allowing a train to travel from one complex to another without ever seeing the sky. They planned for underground roads wide enough for 2 trucks to pass each other. They designed ventilation shafts that would reach hundreds of meters up to the surface, capped with camouflaged chimneys that looked like tree stumps or rock formations. The geological survey teams worked in a frenzy. They drilled core samples, testing the rock for faults and water tables. They found that the gneiss was hard, yes, but it was also fractured. This meant that while the mountain offered protection, it also offered a deadly challenge: instability. Every meter of tunnel dug would have to be reinforced immediately or the roof would collapse. This requirement for reinforcement meant that Riese would consume concrete at a rate that threatened to bankrupt the rest of the German war effort. It is estimated that the cement allocated to Riese in 1944 alone exceeded the amount used for the entire civilian air raid shelter program in Berlin for that year. As the winter of 1943 set in, the snow began to fall on the Aal Mountains, hiding the scars of the initial earthworks. But under the white blanket, the machinery did not stop. The first shafts were sunk. The sound of explosions began to echo through the valleys, a rhythmic thumping that sounded like a heartbeat. The locals who remained on the periphery whispered about earthquakes, but they knew better. The giant was waking up. The strategic purpose of this massive undertaking was compartmentalized. Even the high-ranking officers didn't know the full scope. Some were told it was the new Führer headquarters, FHQ, a replacement for the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, which was becoming threatened by the Soviet advance. Others were told it was for the production of the V-2 rocket. Others believed it was for chemical weapon storage. This ambiguity was intentional. Hitler loved to play his subordinates against each other, and he loved secrecy. But the scale of Riese suggests it was meant to be all of these things at once: a fortress, a factory, and a city. A place where the Reich could survive the apocalypse and launch a counterstroke. By early 1944, the preliminary infrastructure was complete. The roads were paved. The power was on. The camps for the SS guards were built, complete with comfortable barracks and heating. But the workforce was missing. German workers were fighting at the front. The organization Tot needed bodies, expendable bodies. And so, the trains began to arrive from the east, carrying the human material that would be fed into the stone. This marked the end of the preparatory phase and the beginning of the horror. The mountains were ready to eat. The arrival of the labor force marked the transition of Project Riese from a construction site into a crime scene. In April 1944, the administration of the project was officially handed over to the SS, specifically to the leadership of the Gross-Rosen concentration camp, located some 60 kilometers to the north. Gross-Rosen was notorious within the camp system for its brutality. It was a Category 3 camp, designed for heavy laborers who were not expected to survive. The SS established a network of subcamps directly in the Aal Mountains, collectively known as Arbeitslager Riese. These were not camps with gas chambers. The method of killing here was different. It was Vernichtung durch Arbeit, extermination through labor. The prisoners arrived in cattle cars at the stations of Walim and Głuszyce. They were a mixture of Hungarian Jews, Polish political prisoners, Greeks, and Soviet POWs. Upon disembarking, they were not greeted by barracks but often by mud fields surrounded by electrified barbed wire. In the early months before the wooden huts were fully erected, many slept in finished tents, round plywood structures that offered zero insulation against the biting Silesian frost. The mud in the camps was knee-deep, a freezing slurry of clay and waste that sucked the heat out of starving bodies. The daily routine was a cycle of mechanized cruelty. Réveillé was at 4:30 a.m. Breakfast consisted of a cup of ersatz coffee, a bitter black water made from roasted acorns or grain, and a thin slice of bread, often stretched with sawdust to increase its weight. On this caloric deficit, the men were marched 5 to 8 kilometers to the work sites. The march itself was a gauntlet. The roads were steep, icy, and patrolled by guards with dogs. Those who fell behind were beaten. Those who could not get up were shot in the ditch. But the true horror awaited them inside the mountains. We must look closely at the engineering method used to hollow out Riese, for it was in the technical details that the suffering was maximized. The tunneling method was drill and blast. The organization Tot engineers would mark the face, the solid wall of gneiss rock, with red paint, indicating where the boreholes needed to be placed. The prisoners were then ordered forward with heavy pneumatic drills. These machines weighed over 50 pounds. They vibrated with bone-shattering intensity. A malnourished man weighing barely 90 pounds himself had to press his entire body weight against the drill to penetrate the stone. The geology of the Aal Mountains is rich in quartz and silica. When the drills bit into the rock, they created a fine white dust. In a professional mining operation, water is pumped into the drill tip to suppress this dust. But in Riese, speed was the only metric that mattered. The drilling was often done dry. Within minutes of the shift starting, the tunnels would fill with a dense, white fog. Visibility dropped to less than a meter. The noise was deafening, a relentless, screaming roar of compressed air and steel on stone that echoed off the tunnel walls, destroying the hearing of anyone inside. The dust was the silent killer. It was composed of microscopic shards of glass-like silica. When inhaled, it didn't just irritate the lungs, it shredded them. The prisoners developed acute silicosis within weeks. They would cough up grey phlegm, then blood, and finally, they would simply suffocate as their lungs turned to stone. The SS guards, aware of the danger, stood well back near the entrances or wore respirators, watching the human machines vanish into the white cloud. Once the holes were drilled, the Sprengmeister, the blasting master, would arrive. The holes were packed with Dunarit, a German industrial explosive. The tunnels were cleared and the charges were detonated. The explosion would tear tons of rock from the mountain's heart. But the work didn't stop for the smoke to clear. The mucking out crews were sent in immediately. They had to shovel the jagged, heavy debris into mine carts in an atmosphere thick with toxic fumes and lingering dust. This was the most dangerous time. The roof of the tunnel, freshly shattered by the blast, was unstable. Widowmakers, large slabs of rock loosened by the explosion, would frequently detach from the ceiling, crushing the men below instantly. The debris removal logistics were staggering. Millions of tons of rock had to be hidden. The narrow-gauge railways, the Feldbahn, ran non-stop. The spoil was not just dumped, it was landscaped. It was used to build roads, terraces, and camouflage berms. The forest floor was raised by meters in some areas. If you walk the woods today, you're often walking on the bones of the mountain, spread out to hide the scars of the excavation. At the Osówka complex, the ambition of the architecture becomes clear. Here, the prisoners were forced to build not just tunnels but massive finished structures. The guardroom and the casino required intricate carpentry to build the molds for the concrete. The concrete pouring was a continuous operation. Huge mixers churned day and night. The prisoners had to carry 50-kilogram sacks of cement up the muddy slopes on their backs, forming human chains of misery. If a man stumbled and dropped a sack, he was often beaten to death on the spot for sabotage. The technical specifications for the concrete in Osówka were unusually high. It was fortified with steel shavings and special aggregates to make it resistant to heavy aerial bombardment. The walls of the tunnels were lined with this material, then covered with insulation board to prevent humidity, and finally plastered. This level of finish in a facility that was technically a construction site suggests that parts of Osówka were nearing operational status. They were installing the plumbing, the ceramic pipes for drainage, and the cabling for electricity while the war was collapsing around them. The mortality rate was catastrophic. In the camp of Wolfsburg, situated near the massive Włodarz complex, the turnover of prisoners was relentless. A train would arrive with 1,000 men. 3 weeks later, half were dead or in the lazaret, the infirmary huts where the sick were left to die without medicine. The bodies were initially buried in mass graves in the forest, but as the numbers rose, the SS began shipping them to the crematorium at Gross-Rosen. The project was consuming human lives as fuel, burning them out to carve a few more meters of tunnel into a mountain that didn't care. As 1944 turned to 1945, the conditions worsened. The food supply lines began to fail as the Allies bombed the German rail network. The rations were cut to starvation levels. Typhus broke out in the camps, spreading through the lice-infested bunks like wildfire. Yet the work did not slow down. If anything, it accelerated. The orders from Berlin were frantic. Faster, deeper, finish it. The desperation of the Nazi regime was translated into the whip of the capos. They were trying to build a miracle in the dark, using the last remnants of their strength to hide something or someone before the end came. While Osówka displays the most advanced level of surface finishing, the true titan of the project lies a few kilometers to the southeast, inside the massif of Wolfsburg. This is the Włodarz complex. In terms of sheer volume and ambition, Włodarz dwarfs everything else in the Al Mountains. It was designed to be a subterranean city in its own right, a grid of such complexity that even today, after decades of exploration, we have likely only mapped a fraction of it. The scale of Włodarz is difficult to grasp without standing inside it. The plan called for 4 massive parallel entrances, bored directly into the base of the mountain, leading to a central network of intersecting halls. These were not narrow corridors. They were designed to be 12 meters wide and 10 meters high. They were cavernous enough to accommodate double-track railways, heavy trucks, and overhead cranes. The total length of the known tunnels exceeds 3,000 meters. But the spacing of the entrances suggests a much larger intended footprint, potentially extending deep into the core of the mountain where it would connect with the other sites. Today, Włodarz presents a unique and terrifying obstacle to historians: water. The Nazi engineers had barely begun the process of concrete lining when the war ended. Most of Włodarz remains in its raw state, jagged, unsupported gneiss. Without the pumps running, the natural aquifers of the mountain have reclaimed the lower levels. The complex is now a subterranean lake. Exploring it requires boats. As you drift silently over the black, freezing water, you pass under vaulted ceilings that vanish into the darkness. Beneath the keel of the boat, submerged in the crystal-clear but sunless water, lie the remnants of 1945. Rusted mining carts, stacks of rotting timber, and piping systems that were abandoned mid-installation. The water hides the secrets of the lower levels. Sonar scans and diving expeditions have revealed shafts plunging vertically into the depths, now blocked by debris or collapsed rock. There are persistent theories that Włodarz has multiple levels, a basement beneath the flooded floor that was sealed off before the water rose. What lies in those sealed sections? The missing blueprints, the machinery, or simply the tombs of the prisoners who built them? The silence of the flooded halls offers no answers, only the rhythmic drip of condensation that sounds like a ticking clock. But to understand the potential purpose of Włodarz, we must look outside the tunnels to the valley of Ludwikowice Kłodzkie, located just a few miles away. Here, standing in an open field, is perhaps the most bizarre and debated structure of the entire Second World War. It is officially known as the cooling tower base of the Wenceslas mine power station, but to the locals and the researchers of the occult, it is known as the fly trap, Muchołapka, or the henge. It is a massive, dodecagonal, 12-sided ring of reinforced concrete raised above the ground on thick pillars. It looks like a brutalist version of Stonehenge. The official explanation is prosaic. It was the foundation for a wooden cooling tower used by the power plant. And indeed, cooling towers of this design existed, but the details of this specific structure do not fit the standard industrial template. The concrete is excessively reinforced, far beyond what is needed to hold up a wooden shell. The pillars are thick, designed to withstand immense vibration or downward pressure. More disturbingly, the electrical infrastructure surrounding the fly trap is disproportionate. During the war, the Germans upgraded the power plant at the Wenceslas mine to generate a staggering amount of electricity, far more than the local grid or the mine itself required. Heavy-duty, high-voltage cables, shielded in lead and thick rubber, ran from the generators directly to the concrete ring. Why would a cooling tower need a direct line of high-voltage current? This anomaly creates the foundation for the Wunderwaffe theories. Intelligence reports from the Polish underground and later interrogations suggest that this area was a testing ground for experimental propulsion physics. The fly trap is often cited as the test rig for Die Glock, the bell. The theory posits that the concrete ring was used to tether a heavy rotating device that generated uncontrollable anti-gravity effects. The heavy current was not for cooling, it was to power the electromagnetic centrifuges inside the device. The isolation of the site, hidden in a valley surrounded by high ridges, would have been perfect for containing radiation or magnetic anomalies. Whether you believe in the bell or not, the strategic importance of the Ludwikowice site is undeniable. It was the energy heart of Riese. Without the power generated here, the drills in Włodarz and Osówka would have fallen silent. The Germans defended this valley with fanaticism. Flak towers, anti-aircraft gun emplacements, were built on the surrounding hills to protect the power plant and the fly trap from Allied bombers. You do not build a ring of heavy anti-aircraft defenses around a simple coal mine unless it is critical to the war effort. Connecting Włodarz and the power plant was a web of logistics that relied on secrecy. The roads were screened with camouflage netting. The train schedules were classified. The SS created a closed-loop system. The coal came from the mine, the power went to the fly trap and the tunnels, and the waste rock from the tunnels was used to bury the landscape. It was a self-contained ecosystem of industry and death, operating in a black hole of information. As we move deeper into the complex, we find another anomaly at the site known as Riese. It is smaller than Włodarz, but it occupies a strategic position at a mountain pass. Here, the tunnels are nearly finished. The concrete guardhouses are complete. The ventilation system was operational. Riese feels less like a mine and more like a bunker that was ready for occupants. But who? There are no barracks for thousands of soldiers. There are no vast storage depots for ammunition. The layout resembles a command center or a secure archive. This leads to the speculation about the Riese project's true deadline. We know that in 1944, Albert Speer allocated the project the highest priority rating in the Reich, Sperrbetrieb. This meant it superseded even the production of tanks and fighter jets for raw materials. Why? In the final year of the war, when the front lines were collapsing, why pour millions of Reichsmarks into a hole in the ground in Silesia? Unless the Nazi leadership believed that what they were building here could change the outcome of the war, or ensure their survival after it. The sheer density of the concrete, the over-engineered power grids, and the frantic pace of construction all point to a deadline that was rapidly approaching. They were racing against time, not just to finish the roof but to install something inside. And in the chaotic spring of 1945, as the Soviet artillery began to rumble on the horizon, the focus shifted from construction to concealment. The order was no longer build, it was hide. To understand the full scope of the Nazi delusion, we must leave the muddy, forested slopes of Włodarz and travel a few kilometers north to a place where the brutality of reinforced concrete collides with the elegance of the aristocracy. This is Książ Castle, known to the Germans as Schloss Fürstenstein. It sits perched on a dramatic rocky promontory, surrounded by a deep gorge of the Pocznica River. For over 400 years, it was the seat of the Hochberg family, one of the wealthiest and most influential dynasties in Prussia. It was a place of crystal chandeliers, velvet tapestries, and manicured gardens. But in 1941, the music stopped. The Nazi regime seized the castle, nominally to cover the tax debts of the Hochberg family, but in reality, to claim it for a higher purpose. In 1943, the organization Todt descended upon the palace. They did not come to preserve it, they came to weaponize it. Książ was selected to become the crown jewel of Project Riese. While the tunnels in the mountains were designated for industry and research, the castle was destined to become the new Führer headquarters, FHQ. The renovation that followed was an act of architectural vandalism. The Nazi aesthetic despised the soft, decorative style of the Baroque and Rococo periods. They preferred the Spartan classicism favored by Albert Speer, imposing, sterile, and monumental. The Todt engineers stripped the interior of the castle. They tore down intricate stucco work, ripped up parquet floors, and bricked over ornate fireplaces. The magnificent Conrad Hall, once the venue for royal balls, was gutted and rebuilt with heavy limestone facing, transforming it into a somber briefing room suitable for military maps and generals. But the true transformation was happening beneath the foundations. The engineers realized that a medieval castle, no matter how thick its walls, could not withstand a modern tallboy bomb. To make Fürstenstein safe for the leadership of the Third Reich, they had to anchor it into the earth. They began to dig a colossal vertical shaft directly through the courtyard of honor. This was an engineering feat of terrifying precision. The shaft plunges 50 meters, over 15 stories, straight down through solid rock. It measures 6 meters in diameter. It was designed to house 2 high-speed, heavy-lift elevators. The logistical concept was chillingly efficient. In the event of an air raid siren, Adolf Hitler could step from his private suite on the first floor, enter the elevator, and be transported deep into the granite bedrock in less than 40 seconds. At the bottom of this shaft lies the second subterranean world of Riese. The tunnels under Książ differ radically from the rough, unfinished caverns of Włodarz. Here, the construction is refined. The walls are fully lined with smooth concrete. There are distinct levels, one at 15 meters deep and the main system at 50 meters deep. The tunnels are equipped with side chambers for ventilation machinery, filtration systems to protect against poison gas attacks, and independent water supplies. The scale is massive. The underground area covers over 3,000 square meters. What makes the Książ tunnels so unsettling is the attention to comfort. Unlike the damp hell of the labor camps, these tunnels were being fitted with ceramic tiling in the bathrooms, central heating systems, and insulated doors. They were building a luxury hotel inside a bunker. The layout suggests a hierarchy: zones for the SS bodyguards, zones for the secretarial staff, and a restricted zone for the Führer himself. However, the elevator shaft was not the only entrance. The master plan reveals the true strategic genius and paranoia of the design. The underground complex under the castle was not an island. It was intended to be a hub. Documents and survivor testimonies suggest that a railway tunnel was being driven from the main Leipzig-Wrocław line towards the castle. The goal was to allow the Führer Sonderzug, Hitler's personal armored train named America, to detach from the main rail network and drive directly into the side of the hill beneath the castle. This would allow the Nazi leadership to arrive and depart in total invisibility. A train would simply vanish into the mountain. Once inside the secure tunnel, the passengers would disembark onto a subterranean platform and take the elevator up to the castle, never once exposing themselves to the open sky or the eyes of a potential assassin. It was a plan for a phantom government. The secrecy surrounding the work at Książ was absolute. The castle grounds were encircled by a double ring of barbed wire and guarded by the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the elite bodyguard division. The prisoners who worked on the elevator shaft were kept separate from the other labor details. They were the Geheimnisträger, the bearers of secrets. It is widely believed that none of the prisoners who dug the final sections of the shaft survived the war. They knew too much about the vulnerability of the Führer's panic room. By 1944, the castle had become a hive of activity. While the Eastern Front was collapsing and the Red Army was pushing across the Vistula, the organization Todt was still installing marble bathrooms and oak paneling in the castle suites. This disconnect from reality characterizes the final phase of the Reich. They were beautifying the Titanic as it sank, but there is a detail in the construction that suggests they were preparing for more than just air raids. Explorers have found traces of heavy-duty, shielded cabling running into the unfinished sections of the Książ tunnels. These were not standard electrical wires. They were coaxial cables, similar to those used for radar and high-frequency communications. This supports the theory that Książ was intended to be the nerve center for the Riese complex. If the mountains of Osówka and Włodarz were the factories and labs, Książ was the brain. Data from the Wunderwaffe experiments, reports from the front and orders to the Wehrmacht would all flow through these shielded cables, protected by 50 meters of rock. The connection between the castle and the rest of the Riese sites remains the subject of intense speculation. Did they manage to connect the tunnel systems? Is there a navigable passage from the basement of Książ all the way to the mines of Włodarz, miles away? Most geologists say no. The distance is too great for the time they had. But ground-penetrating radar anomalies continue to appear in the forests between the sites. We know the Germans were masters of boring narrow service drifts for ventilation and cabling. It is entirely possible that a physical data link existed, a literal internet of tunnels connecting the castle to the laboratories. As the spring of 1945 approached, the work at Książ reached a fever pitch. The elevators were being installed, the furniture was being moved in. But Hitler never came. He remained in the bunker in Berlin, descending into madness as the Soviet artillery pulverized the capital. Książ, the impregnable fortress built at the cost of thousands of lives and millions of Reichsmarks, stood empty. It was a palace for a ghost. Here is part 5 of 8. The Stone Giant, Project Riese, part 5 of 8. While the engineers at Książ were preparing an elevator for a dictator who would never arrive, a different kind of desperation was unfolding 60 kilometers to the east. To understand the most famous mystery of the Owl Mountains, we must leave the tunnels for a moment and stand on the platform of the main railway station in Breslau, now Wrocław, in January 1945. The city, once the jewel of Silesia, was being transformed into Festung Breslau, Fortress Breslau. The Soviet Red Army had encircled the city. The air was filled with the sound of artillery and the smoke of burning archives. In this chaotic atmosphere, the priority of the Nazi administration shifted from defense to evacuation. But they were not just evacuating people. They were evacuating the loot of a continent. Breslau was a banking center. Its vaults held the gold reserves of the Silesian industrial magnates, the deposits of the terrified population, and, according to persistent rumors, crates of art looted from museums across Eastern Europe. As the Russian tanks approached the Oder River, a decision was made. The treasure could not fall into Soviet hands. Witness accounts from the time describe a scene of frantic activity under the cover of darkness. A specialized train was assembled at the station. This was not a standard freight train. It consisted of armored wagons reinforced with steel plating to withstand partisan attacks and air raids. It was pulled by a heavy-duty locomotive, likely a Panzertriebwagen, designed for combat zones. Truck after truck arrived from the Reichsbank and the police headquarters. Soldiers loaded heavy wooden crates onto the wagons. The contents were marked Secret Reich Matter. The train, now known to history as the Gold Train, departed Breslau heading west. Its destination was the safety of the interior, the heart of the Sudetenland. It steamed through the night, passing through the town of Świebodzice, then Freiburg. It was scheduled to arrive at the next major station, Wałbrzych, then Waldenburg. But it never checked in. Somewhere in the 10 kilometers of twisting track between these two towns, a train carrying over 300 tons of armored steel and cargo simply evaporated. For decades, historians dismissed this as a ghost story, a fog of war myth concocted by traumatized refugees. But the geography of the line suggests a physical possibility. The railway between Freiburg and Waldenburg winds through steep wooded hills. It is a landscape of embankments, bridges, and cuttings. The legend, corroborated by local railway workers who were terrified into silence by the Gestapo, claims that there was a secret spur line, a railway siding that did not appear on civilian maps. This spur supposedly branched off the main line near kilometer 65. It led directly into a tunnel mouth that had been camouflaged with netting and fake vegetation. The gold train was driven onto this spur, entered the tunnel, and the doors were blasted shut behind it. The entrance was then buried under tons of earth and planted with trees. The train was not destroyed. It was parked. It was effectively put into a safe deposit box made of a mountain. Why the Owl Mountains? Because by 1945, this region was the safest storage locker in the Third Reich. The network of tunnels being dug for Project Riese was designed exactly for this purpose, to hide things. The timing aligns perfectly. The tunnels at Osówka and Włodarz were unfinished, yes, but they were large enough to hide a train. We know the Germans were building underground train stations. We see the platforms in the blueprints. It is entirely plausible that one of these service tunnels was completed just enough to house a high-value convoy before being sealed. The mystery deepened in the months following the capitulation. When the Russians and later the Polish authorities took control of the area, they found the railway documentation incomplete. The logbooks for that specific night in January were missing or destroyed. The German railway staff who knew the switching signals had fled or been executed. The only people who knew the location of the siding were the members of the SS Werwolf units, stay-behind commandos tasked with guarding the buried assets of the Reich. In the years after the war, the legend of the gold train became a curse for the region. Treasure hunters, often armed with crude maps sold to them by con artists, dug holes in the forest. Many died. The mountains are littered with unexploded ordnance, rusted mines, and ventilation shafts that drop 50 meters into the dark. The guardians of the legend, whether real SS veterans or simply the paranoia of the locals, kept the curious away. There were unexplained accidents. People who asked too many questions about the railway embankments tended to disappear. The story exploded back into global consciousness in 2015, when two amateur researchers claimed to have found the train using ground-penetrating radar, GPR. Their images showed a blurry, blocky shape buried deep under a railway embankment near Wałbrzych. The shape resembled a line of tanks or armored wagons. The world's media descended on the small Polish town. The Polish army was deployed to clear the trees and check for mines. It felt as if the stone giant was finally going to give up its prize. But when the excavators finally dug into the clay, they found nothing but geological anomalies. No steel, no gold. The radar had been tricked by the density of the glacial ice deposits. The world sighed and moved on. But the locals didn't. They pointed out that the dig had only scratched the surface. They argued that the train was buried much deeper, in a tunnel blasted out of the rock, not just covered in dirt. They pointed to the fact that the Nazi engineers were masters of deception. If they wanted to hide a train, they wouldn't leave it where a cheap radar could find it. The gold train remains the most tangible symbol of the unfinished business of Riese. It represents the loot aspect of the project. But there is a darker theory regarding the train's cargo. What if the heavy crates didn't contain gold? The Wunderwaffe research required rare materials, heavy water, uranium oxide, and specialized machinery. If the train was evacuating the laboratories of Breslau's technical institutes, the danger sitting under the tracks of Wałbrzych is not greed but radiation. The railway network of Riese was the circulatory system of the giant. It connected the mines, the factories, and the castles. And like any circulatory system, it has veins that we cannot see from the surface. The ghost train is likely sitting in one of those occluded veins, rusting in the absolute darkness, guarded by tons of rock and 80 years of silence. It is a reminder that in the Owl Mountains the map is not the territory. The territory is hollow and it is full of ghosts waiting for a signal that will never change from red to green. To penetrate the deepest layer of the Riese mystery, we must step away from the geology and look into the eyes of the man who commanded it. His name was Hans Kammler. In the hierarchy of the Third Reich, Kammler was a figure of shadow. He was not a politician like Goebbels or a public face like Göring. He was an architect by training, an engineer by trade, and a monster by vocation. As an SS Obergruppenführer, he was the man who had designed the gas chambers at Auschwitz-Birkenau. He had turned genocide into an industrial process. By 1944, Hitler had realized that Kammler was the only man capable of delivering the impossible. In the final year of the war, the Führer transferred control of all advanced weapons projects, the V-2 rockets, the jet fighters, and the nuclear research, directly to Kammler. He became the wizard of the Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapons, and in late 1944, Kammler moved his headquarters to the Owl Mountains. This fact alone changes the narrative of Riese. Kammler did not hide in bunkers, he built weapons. His presence suggests that the tunnels were not merely a shelter, but a production line for technology that was supposed to turn the tide of the war in a single stroke. The rumors that surround Kammler's activities in Lower Silesia center on a device that has become the holy grail of alternative history, Die Glocke, the bell. The primary source for this legend comes from the interrogation protocols of SS Gruppenführer Jakob Sporenberg, captured by the British and handed over to the Poles after the war. Sporenberg spoke of a project code-named Kronos, or Laternenträger, lantern bearer. He described a device that defied the known laws of physics. According to the intelligence reports, the bell was a metallic object, roughly 9 feet wide and 12 to 15 feet high, shaped like a large church bell. It was made of a hard, heavy metal. Inside, there were 2 counter-rotating cylinders filled with a violet, mercury-like substance codenamed Zerum 525. This substance had to be stored in lead-lined flasks. When the bell was activated, it consumed enormous amounts of electricity. The counter-rotating cylinders created a high-energy field that emitted a strange, pale blue luminescence. The effects of this field were terrifying. During the initial tests, plants placed within the radius of the bell didn't just burn. They dissolved into a black, grease-like substance within hours. Animals exposed to the field died instantly, their blood crystallizing in their veins, their tissue separating from the bone. The scientists working on the project suffered from sleep disorders, metallic taste in their mouths, and vertigo. Several of the original research team died from what looked like radiation poisoning, but without the standard radioactive markers. The infrastructure of Riese aligns disturbingly well with the requirements of such a device. The fly trap in Ludwikowice, which we examined earlier, sits in a deep valley shielded by rock walls, a perfect containment zone for a device emitting dangerous radiation. The heavy-duty power cables running to the site suggest an energy consumption that far exceeds the needs of a ventilation system. The obsession with heavy water production in the nearby factories suggests nuclear or high-energy particle research. Was Riese a particle accelerator, a facility for enriching uranium, or was it, as the wildest theories suggest, a testbed for anti-gravity propulsion? Kammler was obsessed with breaking the gravity barrier. The Nazis were developing aircraft that looked like saucers, the Haunebu prototypes. If these crafts existed, they needed an engine. The Bell might have been that engine. The isolation of the Al Mountains offered the perfect cover. If a test went wrong and destroyed a valley, no one in Berlin would know. The security surrounding Kammler's Sonderkommando, special unit, was paranoid even by SS standards. The inner circle of scientists and technicians lived in total isolation. They were the Geheimnisträger, the secret bearers. They knew that they would never be allowed to return to civilian life. As the Soviet forces broke through the Vistula line in January 1945, Kammler knew the game was up. He wasn't worried about saving the Reich anymore. He was worried about saving the technology and himself. The liquidation of the project was brutal. This brings us to the tragedy of the Vector site. In the final days, 62 scientists who had worked on the core physics of the Bell were summoned for a debriefing. They were told they were being evacuated to Norway to continue their work. Instead, they were taken to a remote courtyard near the Włodarz complex. They were executed by machine gun fire. Their bodies were dumped into a mine shaft, and the shaft was collapsed with high explosives. The software of the project, the human brains, was deleted. But what about the hardware? What happened to the Bell? It was never found. When the Polish authorities inspected the site, the fly trap was empty. The high-voltage cables had been severed. The heavy lead-lined crates were gone. There are two prevailing theories. The first is that Kammler loaded the device and the remaining documentation onto a heavy-lift Junkers Ju 390 aircraft, a massive 6-engine plane capable of transatlantic flight, and flew it out. To where? Argentina, Antarctica, or perhaps closer to the United States. The second theory connects Kammler to Operation Paperclip, the secret American program to recruit Nazi scientists. Kammler had something better than rockets. He had the physics of the future. Some historians argue that he traded the Bell and its secrets for his life. This would explain why he, one of the most high-profile war criminals of the SS, was never brought to trial at Nuremberg. His death was reported in 3 different places at 3 different times by 3 different people. A classic intelligence smokescreen. Riese, therefore, was not just a hole in the ground. It was the womb for a technology that was too dangerous to be left behind. The empty tunnels of Osówka and Włodarz are the shell. The pearl is gone, but the ghost of Hans Kammler hangs over the valley. The locals still tell stories of the pale men, the scientists who looked like ghosts from working underground, being herded onto trucks in the middle of the night. The implications are chilling. If the Bell existed, and if it worked, then the technology to manipulate gravity and space-time was developed in 1945, in a dark tunnel in Poland, by men who wore the skull and bones on their caps. And if it wasn't destroyed, then somewhere, in a deep black vault, it is still waiting. By February 1945, the illusion of the 1,000-year Reich had crumbled into dust. But in the Al Mountains, the machinery of concealment was just shifting into high gear. The Soviet Red Army was sweeping across the Oder River like a tidal wave. The artillery fire could now be heard from the tunnel entrances, a constant dull thunder rolling over the hills. For the SS administration at Riese, the priority shifted from construction to erasure. They were no longer building a fortress, they were burying a secret. The order given to the project commanders was cryptic: Auflockerung, dispersal. In practice, this meant the systematic elimination of evidence. The first evidence to be removed was the human memory. The liquidation of the Arbeitslager Riese camps began in the freezing cold. The prisoners, already skeletal from months of starvation and silica inhalation, were marshaled into columns. They were not given train tickets. They were forced onto the roads in what would become known as the Death March. Thousands of men were driven west, toward the camps in central Germany that were still under Nazi control. The orders were clear. No prisoner was to fall alive into Soviet hands. Anyone who stumbled, anyone who sat down in the snow to rest was shot immediately by the rear guard. The roads leading out of Walim and Głuszyce were lined with corpses, frozen in the grotesque postures of sudden death. This was a tactical cleaning. The SS was scrubbing the hard drive of the project. With the witnesses gone, the Sprengkommandos, the demolition squads, went to work. These were elite pioneer units, experts in structural engineering. Their mission was counterintuitive. They were not ordered to destroy the tunnels. If you want to destroy a tunnel, you place charges on the support pillars inside the main halls and bring the roof down, crushing the facility forever. The German engineers did not do this. Instead, they targeted the entrances. At Włodarz, and Osówka, they placed massive shaped charges on the rock faces above the tunnel portals. When detonated, these charges caused controlled landslides. Thousands of tons of rock and soil slid down, sealing the mouths of the tunnels like corks in a bottle. They didn't destroy the facility. They locked the door. To complete the illusion, they planted spruce saplings and covered the fresh earth with brushwood. Within a few weeks of spring growth, the entrances to the underworld had vanished. They had turned a military-industrial complex back into a mountain. But they didn't just seal the main doors. They played a game of misdirection with the ventilation shafts. Many shafts were filled with debris, but others were booby-trapped. They installed false bottoms and rigged unexploded aerial bombs to the ladder rungs. They created a deadly obstacle course for anyone curious enough to investigate. This suggests a long-term strategy. The Nazis believed that the alliance between the US and the Soviet Union would collapse, which it did, and that in the ensuing chaos, they might return to reclaim their assets. They were mothballing Riese, not abandoning it. When the Red Army finally rolled into the villages of the Owl Mountains in May 1945, they found a surreal landscape. The valleys were silent. The machinery, the expensive compressors, the drills, the locomotives, was largely gone, evacuated west or hidden in the sealed chambers. The Russians found the casino at Osówka and the empty barracks. They found the fly trap standing silently in the rain, but they couldn't find the way in. The Soviet occupation of Lower Silesia was brutal and chaotic. The trophy brigades of the Red Army stripped everything of value that was left on the surface. They tore up the railway tracks for steel. They dismantled the power lines, but they lacked the maps to penetrate the deep underground. The German documents had been burned in great pyres in the courtyards of the administration buildings. The paper trail was ash. However, the Soviets quickly realized they were not alone in the forest. In the months following the surrender, the Owl Mountains became the hunting ground of the werewolf. The werewolf was a Nazi guerrilla organization, a resistance movement intended to harass the Allied occupation. In most of Germany, the werewolf was a failure, disorganized boys with Panzerfausts. But in Riese it was different. Here the guardians were SS veterans, men who knew the terrain and, more importantly, knew what was hidden underground. Polish settlers who arrived in the region in late 1945 and 1946 reported a reign of terror. They heard gunshots in the forests at night. Men who went scavenging for firewood near the old tunnel sites would disappear. There were reports of sniper fire targeting anyone who lingered too long near certain ravines. The local legend says that these guardians were protecting specific ventilation shafts that led to the gold train or the caches of technical data. They were the sentinels of the ghost city. The Soviet NKVD, secret police, spent 2 years in the area before handing it over to the Polish authorities. During this time, they conducted their own interrogations and searches. It is rumored that they managed to reopen one of the entrances to Włodarz using German POWs as labor. What they found inside remains classified in the archives of Moscow. Did they find the prototypes? Did they find the uranium, or did they just find water? The hydrology of the mountains became the final guardian. Once the power was cut and the German pumps stopped, the water table began to rise. The sumps, the drainage pits at the bottom of the shafts, overflowed. Slowly, relentlessly, The cold black water consumed the lower levels of Riese. It swallowed the railway tracks, the ammunition depots, and the secrets. It rose until it filled the tunnels to the ceiling in some places, creating a natural barrier that no diver could easily pass. By 1947, the Aal Mountains had fallen into a deep sleep. The region was depopulated of Germans and resettled by Poles from the east, who had no connection to the land and no knowledge of its history. The entrances were overgrown. The concrete giants like the fly trap stood as mysterious ruins, their purpose forgotten. The stone giant had successfully hidden itself. But the story was not over. The scars on the land remained, and beneath the roots of the trees, the void was still waiting. For nearly half a century, the Aal Mountains slumbered behind the Iron Curtain. Under the communist regime in Poland, the Riese complex was treated with a mixture of indifference and suspicion. The areas around the tunnels were often designated as military zones or state forestry land, keeping the casual tourist away. The entrances that hadn't been blasted shut by the SS were left to rot, visited only by local children playing dangerous games in the dark. The giant had become a myth, a scary story told to keep people out of the woods. But when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed, the files were opened and the treasure hunters arrived. The 1990s saw a gold rush in Lower Silesia. Men armed with cheap metal detectors and grandfather's maps descended on the valleys. They weren't looking for history. They were looking for the amber room, the Nazi gold, and the lost prototypes. Most found nothing but rusted Wehrmacht helmets and shrapnel, but some found enough to realize that the official maps were lies. They discovered ventilation shafts that appeared on no blueprint. They found concrete foundations in the middle of dense thickets that matched the dimensions of V-2 launch cradles. The rediscovery of Riese was not led by universities, but by amateurs, passionate, obsessed, and often reckless. They cleared the debris from the entrances of Osówka and Rzeczka. They pumped water out of the first levels of Sobon. And what they revealed was a scale of construction that shocked the academic world. Today, the exploration of Riese has moved from shovels to sonar. The Włodarz complex has become the focal point of modern technical diving. It is one of the most dangerous dive sites in Europe. The water in the flooded lower levels is crystal clear, but deceptively deadly. It is near freezing, hovering around 4 degrees Celsius. The tunnels are filled with silt. One wrong kick of a flipper can stir up a cloud of mud that reduces visibility to 0 instantly, trapping a diver in a stone coffin. Divers who have pushed into the furthest reaches of the flooded northern corridors report strange anomalies. They have found bulkheads, massive steel doors that are sealed shut, but unlike the outer blast doors, these appear to be locked from the inside. The mechanisms are on the other side. This physical detail fuels the most haunting theory of all, that when the water rose, it didn't just flood an empty mine, it flooded a facility that was still occupied, or at least intentionally secured, to protect something that could not be moved. Geologists and mining engineers who have analyzed the volume of spoil, the waste rock removed from the mountain, versus the volume of the known tunnels have reached a disturbing conclusion. The math doesn't add up. There is too much waste rock for the tunnels we can see. This suggests that there is a massive amount of missing void space inside the mountain. We are likely seeing only the lobby of Riese. The main halls, the factories, and the true archives are likely hidden behind the collapsed walls at the ends of the corridors, disguised to look like dead ends. The psychological gravity of Riese is immense. It pulls people in. It is a monument to the ultimate hubris of the Third Reich, the belief that they could conquer not just nations but nature itself. They believed they could carve a kingdom out of gneiss that would last 1,000 years. Instead, they built a tomb for 20,000 slaves. The concrete in Osówka is still curing, chemically speaking. It is hardening against time, outlasting the regime that poured it. As we stand at the entrance of the fly trap in the twilight, the silence of the Aal Mountains feels heavy. It is not an empty silence. It is a silence that is holding its breath. The rusted rebar sticking out of the concrete looks like the ribs of a decaying beast. The wind moving through the pine trees sounds like the hiss of a steam train that is perpetually approaching, but never arriving. We may never find the gold train. We may never unearth the bell or the bones of Hans Kammler. The stone giant is jealous of its secrets, The water will keep rising, the moss will keep growing, and the forest will keep covering the scars. But the tunnels are there. They are waiting in the dark, a frozen snapshot of 1945, a subterranean warning from history. The war ended 80 years ago, but deep inside the mountain, beneath the water and the rock, the lights are still out, the doors are locked, and the echo of the last jackhammer has never truly faded away. This is the legacy of Riese,